As an independent financial advisor based in China, I'm very passionate about the ethics that are practiced in our industry. This is particularly relevant in a place like China because there's a risk in the fact that China itself is not regulated when it comes to independent financial advice that's given to expats. Although the local population is highly regulated and to a degree protected, this isn't the case if you're a foreigner living and working in China. This makes you vulnerable to all kinds of abuse and unethical behavior. Probably the worst example I've seen is a good friend of mine whose pension was put into a vehicle that lost 98% of its value, and that's obviously going to have a major negative impact on my friend's future. There's really nothing he can do, nothing's in writing. He was given all kinds of assurances verbally, and he can't take that person to court in China because China's basically not interested in what happens between an independent financial advisor from the West and an expat from the West. Neither can he go to the courts in the West because he doesn't have any paperwork to back him up. So that would be an example of unethical behavior at its worst. For me, there are certain minimums that should be a requirement in our industry, and they've become more the norm in the regulated parts of the world since the crash of 2008 and 9. And one of the central pillars of regulation is that an independent financial advisor must, by law, put their clients' interests first. And therefore, in the regulated markets, everything's put into writing, the reasons why actions are being taken, and all the commissions and levels of fees and services are transparent. That, for me, is a minimum requirement here in China as well. And for me, it's clear that regulation alone can't achieve that. That's recognised in the West as well, where principles are given often rather than rules, because ethics should pervade an organisation and filter down from the very top all the way through to everybody working at that organisation. So for me, whilst that's a minimum standard, I would like to see things go a lot further. There's a truism in our industry that you shouldn't give advice to somebody that you wouldn't be prepared to give to your own mother. And I think that's a pretty good indicator. So whilst a piece of advice might on paper be suitable for somebody, an advisor might feel that that advice really doesn't suit that person very well, and they may be induced to give that advice because they want to make a commission. So putting the client at the very heart of one's advice parameters is for me an essential. I know there are very good advisors in China who are ethical, who are bound in that way by moral compass, and there are some very unethical advisors who give our reputation a bad name and who unfortunately are remembered probably with more sense of grief and anger than the good advisors are remembered with happiness. So my ideal world would be to form some kind of organisation amongst advisors based in China that met some of these minimum requirements, putting the client first, explaining why suitability is crucial, and what are all the fees in a completely transparent manner. Anyone who wasn't prepared to sign up to that group would, by their very nature, suggest that they weren't happy to abide by those minimum requirements. I would like to see something like that happening. Let's see if it does. In the meantime, what I can give you are some questions that you might want to ask an advisor and some red flags that should send you firmly in the other direction. So, first of all, some good questions. There's some obvious ones to ask. For example, what are your qualifications? And asking to see a copy of any certificates or qualifications, not simply taking that person's word for it. Again, unfortunately, given that we're in an unregulated environment, people can put letters after their name without actually having taken the exams relevant to those letters. So number one, qualifications. Number two, What are the exact fees and terms and conditions and of all the products that the client is being recommended? And there should be a very clear understanding of how these work, what the charges are, and over what period of time they're being incurred. That should all be clearly written down in paperwork, something that's signed by both parties, something that can be used as a reference point later. And I would also say let's go a bit further than purely looking at fees. If somebody comes to you and says, I can get you a 12% guaranteed return, I want to see that in writing. I want it signed by the relevant parties, dated by the relevant parties. And then I want to know what are the compliance procedures in place to ensure that your money is safe and that your capital is protected. Again, any good advisor worth their salt will be able to point you to the precise custodian, bank or trustee who is holding your money. And you'll be able to Google that organization or those banks and look at their track record for yourself. That brings me to another point, which is that you should demand all the necessary paperwork well ahead of signing anything yourself. And I would take that to another independent advisor and ask for their opinion. There's no harm whatsoever in getting a second opinion from an independent advisor. And then lastly, I would ask to talk to clients. Now, this can be good and bad. Clients obviously are going to be selected on the basis that they're happy with the advisor, but nonetheless one will get a sense of how that client is being treated, whether they've been dealt with fairly, and what gripes they might have about the process or the advice that's been given. Lastly, I just want to finish with some red flags, things you should really be aware of. If anybody in this day and age offers you anything over 10% return, I would politely shake their hand, smile, and walk quickly away. Don't allow greed for returns, for growth, to blind you to the fact of the obvious saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Also, be cautious about any cold calls that come your way. Find out where the person got your number and why they're calling you, why specifically they think you might be suitable as a client. Cold calling in itself is not necessarily a sign of a scam, but traditionally it has been a method that's been used. Third, I would avoid any pressure tactics whatsoever. If somebody's trying to sign you up quickly, get it now while it's hot, that kind of thing, I would just again smile, thank them politely, and walk away. Again, any good advisor understands that with a major investment of your money, it will need to be a considered approach. You'll want to take your time, do your due diligence, speak to potentially other parties involved, and make sure that what you're doing really is ethical advice. If all those boxes are ticked and you work with an ethical advisor, you'll do far better generally than you will yourself. So, this is my small piece of advice towards a much greater picture. Let's all work together towards getting a more ethical picture for independent financial advice in China.